Okay, we are recording. All right, well, good morning again, everyone, and welcome to our Bible study this day. Remember, everyone is muted and that you will need to unmute in order to participate. I can no longer unmute you. You have to do that yourself. We may as well jump right in and pick up where we left last week. We are, of course, continuing our study of the Gospel according to Mark. And we last week started chapter 5 and were able to do the healing of the Gerasene demoniac. And this week we are now going to proceed with Jairus's daughter and the woman with a hemorrhage. Okay, so who would like to read starting chapter 5, verse 21?
I'll read. Karen.
Okay, Karen, go ahead.
Daughter and the woman with a hemorrhage. When Jesus to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him. He stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him.
Okay, let's stop there for a minute. So, because this is really going to be two stories in one, so let's take it a little piece at a time, and then we'll be able to get a better sense of it. Okay, so remember when Jesus crossed again in the boat to the other side. Remember, this is something that I said Mark does a lot. At this point in his gospel, he has Jesus going from one side of Galilee to the other. So let's pull up our map and see where Jesus is and where he is going. Why isn't my share working here? There we are. Okay, so remember, Jesus was up in Capharnaum over here, and he crossed to the other side, probably over here where it indicates at Gergesa, which is where the Gerasene demoniac was. And now he's going to cross back to the other side. And we're not sure exactly right now where it's saying where in the other side he is, right? Did it say, did it tell us? He didn't give us the town that he's crossing over to. So we just know that he's gone over to the other side. Now, who remembers last week about the significance of one side versus the other side?
The pagans live on the east side.
Right.
Pagans live on the east side, and the Jews live on the left.
Okay.
Or east or west.
Yeah. So the pagans or the Gentiles are on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. So the story we read last week was the man he healed was Gentile, was not Jewish. Remember, and that was where all the swine were, the pigs. Because the Gentiles eat pigs, but not the Jews. And so by crossing back over, he's now back in Jewish territory. He's back among the Israelites. And how do we know that? Let me see. Let's go back and share again. Okay, how do we know what other than just the other side, what in the story, what description of Jairus lets you know that you're in Jewish territory?
Um, I don't see the line. He's, yeah, what is it, Sadducee or one of the religious?
Well,
Where is he?
what does Saint Mark call him?
Synagogue
He's
official.
a synagogue official. Okay. So the synagogues are where the Jews gathered to pray and study scripture, right? It's not clear. I mean, a Pharisee or a Sadducee would be sort of what sect of Judaism he was. So that's not identified for us. So we don't know. Um, and as an official, it doesn't necessarily mean he was quote unquote clergy. Okay. He's not necessarily, he's not identified as a rabbi. As an official, he could have been like the president of the synagogue. Any of you who may have Jewish friends and may have talked about how their synagogues are set up, they have lay boards that manage and run the synagogue, and their rabbis and cantors, you know, the sort of the religiously trained people, are simply employees of the synagogue. But it generally, as the synagogue is owned and run by a lay board, a board of lay people. That doesn't mean the rabbi is, you know, just an ordinary one among the others. I mean, he obviously is given the respect and the authority as a rabbi, but ultimately the control of the synagogue, the management of the synagogue, falls to the board of directors. So the synagogue official, this guy Jairus, could very well be somebody like that. He could be, you know, a lay person, but is is one of the managers of the synagogue. Okay. So what does Jairus do? He comes to Jesus and
He asked Jesus to heal his daughter because she was at the point of death.
okay. And what does that indicate to you about what he thinks of Jesus?
That he has faith that Jesus will heal.
Yeah, he believes that Jesus can do this. And it's a little bit of a shift because if you remember the last time Jesus was in a synagogue, it didn't go all that well for him, right? He offended people because he healed on a Sabbath. They started a plot to move him off the scene already and everything. And here, an actual synagogue official is showing trust and faith in Jesus. So one of the things you have to always remember when you're looking at these stories is we can't lump everybody into the same group, okay? So even the same thing with Pharisees and Sadducees, you know, Herodians and all these folks. You know, when people are identified, we can't just then assume that everybody in that group meets that description. So, you know, not all people in the synagogue are going to have problems with Jesus. And clearly this synagogue official doesn't have any problem. Okay, so keep Jairus on your mind because we'll come back to him. So they're on their way, all right, to go to heal Jairus's daughter, and a large crowd is following him and pressing upon him. Okay, so that'll be important as we go on. Okay, Karen, continue. Are you there, Karen? You might have to unmute yourself if you're trying to speak.
Okay. There was a woman. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately, her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, touch me? And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction."
Okay. All right. What are your first impressions of this story?
Well, my thoughts are, excuse me. First, well, I don't know of this particular story that this had to be a strong woman of faith, that she felt just being near Jesus, just touching him was going to heal her. Because from what I see, she didn't say anything to him. She just reached out and touched him. So that shows faith that he would do what she believed he would do.
Okay, so you see a person of faith. Hey, Dee, I was wondering, because I can see you're trying to communicate, but we're not getting. Can you call in? Do you have your cell phone with you? Could you just call the number and just that way you could talk too? Yeah, your audio is not working. We hear you, but we can't really make out what you're saying because it's too garbled. So that's what I was thinking. If you could just call on your phone, maybe your phone would get a better connection. You know, like what Diane is doing. You know, you can keep your video on, but just call in with your cell phone. That way we can get your audio. All right. So Esther's saying, so right off she sees a person of faith who just kind of comes up to Jesus, doesn't actually even talk to him, but just sort of has faith that he can heal her. What else do you see in the story?
I don't know if I'm unmuted.
Yes, I can hear you, Gwen.
Okay. I think it's interesting. The details that I find interesting is that he could feel this energy going from him.
Okay.
I find interesting. And, you know, and of course what Esther said, and he pointed out that, and he being Jesus, that it is her faith that cured her. And he says that often. It is your faith that is what's curing you. Because without that faith, it's not going to happen. You know, that's the impression I get. If you don't have the faith, it's a two-way thing.
So play with that a little bit. He could feel power going out from her, and he knew she had faith.
And it's because of that I see that the healing did occur. And, you know, so even if we look at our own lives, you know, when we are afflicted with something, anything, could be something tiny, minor that's just hurting us, or something big, it is the thing that helps to get us through. It is having the faith that it's going to be better.
Okay, so Dee, if you just called in, then what you have to make sure is that your computer system is completely, all the audio is turned off. Because otherwise right now we're getting feedback.
Okay, I did that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you're not getting feedback, right? Right, good.
No, I'm muted on the screen.
Yeah, good. So now we can hear you. Got a little feedback, but that's all right. So Gwen, she has faith, and power comes from out from Jesus. Did Jesus direct the power to her?
So right, go ahead.
Were you going to say something?
I don't. Her faith in him is what carried her. And because she believed in him, all became right with her. I mean, an example for me was when my son died. I never questioned why he took my son. I knew he'd tell me in his own good time. But my son was on a ventilator, and they kept saying they wanted to disconnect him, and I wouldn't go along with it until I crawled into bed and asked my son, is this what you want? And even though they tell me technically he was dead, he had no brain waves, he was gone. But he dipped his head, yes. And that's the only reason I took him off. I allowed them to take him off, was because that was his wish, not mine. That was not my wish. That was his wish. And God gave him the strength or whatever, and my belief in God, that allowed my son to dip his head long enough for me to know to take him off the ventilator, because that was his wish. So yeah, God will do it. You just have to believe.
So, well, right. I mean, it's actually the two, right? Your faith, the way I read the story is that her faith gives her access to Jesus's power, right? There's no indication. There's no indication that Jesus knew she was coming behind him, knew that she wanted to be healed, and that Jesus directed his power towards her. There's no. Do you get that from the story at all?
Nope.
No.
No, because he says, who touched me? So if he was going to direct the power to her, he would have known who touched him.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So he don't even know who touched her.
Right.
He knows that power has gone from him. Right. So you don't steal Jesus's power without him knowing it, so to speak. So she doesn't steal his power, so to speak. But her faith gives her access to that power. Without Jesus even having to know that she's there or even decide to give it to her. Think about that. What does that say to you?
That says to me that the Holy Spirit is at work, and it is through your faith, and the Holy Spirit is connecting her with Jesus.
Yeah, that the power of God is all around us, and it's our faith that joins us to that power. Our faith. I mean, at the end when he says your faith has saved you, that our faith itself doesn't save us. We know that God saves us, but it's our faith that gives us access to that salvation. And so, I think that's the really interesting thing about this. Okay, so let's go with Jesus says, who touched my clothes? Why should he care?
Maybe because his feeling the power leaving from him, he knew that he had been touched by someone who had the faith to believe that if they just could touch him, that they would find the healing that they need.
Okay, and so why does he want to know who that is? I think you're right on the right track. So why would he want to know who touched him?
Maybe he wanted to give them a direct blessing.
Okay. He wanted to come into relationship with her.
Come into relationship.
Into a relationship.
I mean, sometimes people interpret this like he was upset, like, who touched me? How dare you touch me and take my power away from me, right? Sometimes I've heard people think of it that way, but I don't think that's at all what Jesus. I think just like Val said, Jesus, somebody with a need, somebody with faith came and touched him, and was granted access to Jesus's power. And I'm sure Jesus is overjoyed about that, but he doesn't want to leave it at that. He wants to come into relationship with this person. He wants to know her, and he wants her to know him. So that's another element, right? That it's not just enough to have access to Jesus's power. We have to have
a relationship.
We have to have a relationship with him. A lot of Catholics poo-poo the Protestant or the evangelistic, I have a personal relationship with Christ, but that is solid theology.
It really is.
We need a personal relationship with Christ. Jesus is a person. Jesus is not an it. Jesus is a he. We need to have a relation. He wants a relationship with us, and we need to come into relationship with him. So kind of what's happening here is really two things, right? The woman, because of her faith, gains access to Jesus's power. And then Jesus, because he knows that power has gone from him, wants to enter into a relationship with the person that has just been healed. Okay.
And his disciples are not there. They don't get it, because they're like, all these people around you, you must be crazy if you think you can know who touched you.
Right,
they don't get it.
They don't understand why he's asking who's touched him and what's happened. Right. Okay. Before we go to the end of that, let's go back to the beginning, just to understand some elements about this. So what did the woman suffer from?
Well, she's bleeding.
She's bleeding. And what is there anything we can assume what kind of bleeding she's experiencing?
Her period is just not ending.
Cycle.
Most scholars will say that yes, this is bleeding from her menstrual bleeding, not she's doesn't have a cut in her arm or something, and she's bleeding from there. And apparently, her menstruation is not on a cycle; it's just been perpetual,
unceasing.
And how long has she had this?
12 years.
For 12 years. In Judaism, does anybody know what the status of a woman who is having her period is while she's actually having the period?
Unclean.
She's unclean.
She's unclean.
She's unclean.
If she's unclean, what does that mean? What happens?
She has to be separated.
She can't
separated.
She can't sleep with her husband. She has to sleep in a different bed than him.
Right.
I'm trying to remember all their rules, because I actually read all of their rules.
Yes, you could read it in Leviticus.
I read all of them.
Yeah, in Leviticus, there's a whole bunch of rules about a woman who's having her period and the restrictions. So yeah, she's separated. She cannot touch other people, or lest they too become unclean. You're right, Pat. She cannot sleep with her husband or have any sexual relations with him during the period.
Bed.
What's that?
They can't even sleep in the same bed.
Can't sleep in the same bed, right? There was, I don't know if it was going on at this time, but there was a period of time where the women would actually, there'd be a separate tent commune, and women who were having their period would go in there during that time, and they would be with each other, but they would be separated from the community. And then another element of being unclean is that you cannot participate in any worship services. Okay, because you're unclean. Your uncleanliness, so to speak, forbids you from participating in religious ritual. So, it's pretty severe to be unclean. And, it's one thing to experience that for a few days during the month, but this is perpetual for this woman, right? So for 12 years, she has been in this state of separation. She's, it's almost as if she were a leper, right? She's pretty much occupies the same status of a leper, become completely separated. So what do you think about her being in this crowd then?
Right. It really says something to the level of her faith, that knowing that she's not supposed to be touching anybody, that she would reach out to touch Christ. And so it really tells you about how deep her faith has to be.
And add it to some of the other facts that we know. That look at verse 26.
But for the fact that she touched the hem of his garment, which means she had to have been on the ground.
Yes.
Even though she was around all these people, I honestly don't believe, even though she was around them, but she wasn't around them at the same time. It was like she was keeping her distance, and I picture her laying on the ground with her hand stretched out. And because of the community, they probably knew her affliction, and they weren't going near it. So that's how she touched the hem of his garment, because he was surrounded by people, but I'm pretty sure they weren't surrounding her.
Well, I don't know. Let's play that out a little bit. If they weren't around her, wouldn't they have known that she touched him?
No, they wouldn't have known it, but Jesus knew it because he felt the power. They gave her room because they knew she was unclean after all these years. You know, it wasn't like these were these big, huge cities like we live in now. And they pretty much knew her business. And they wouldn't go near her because she was unclean. And if she's touching the hem of his garment, she's got to be down on the ground. She didn't touch his sleeve. She didn't touch his garment anywhere else on his garment but the hem. And you've got to be bent down to touch the hem. You can't stand up and do it.
But in this
So I'm
particular
assuming she was on her
does
stomach.
this particular reading say him?
This one actually doesn't say that it was to him. She just says, if I touch his clothes, I shall be cured. But even if
I mean, we generally think of the hem because that's
right.
What
There's another. I forget if it's Matthew or Luke who does say the hem. So we could work with that. To me, I'm not as concerned about that. But I guess I'm wondering, like, describe the scene for me, Pat. What do you see in your mind? When how this is playing out, because I think I see it a little bit differently from the way you're seeing it.
I see her in the crowd coming originally to hear him speak, and upon hearing him speak, she also believes in what he says, and she figures he has the power to do anything. He can do anything. If he can bring dead people back to life, then I'm hoping he can help me with my situation. In the meantime, the people that have also come to see him from that area know that she's been bleeding all this time and that they consider her unclean. Therefore, they're not going to go near her because this is a person you can't touch. She can't feed anybody. She can't touch the food. I mean, the list goes on and on. So they're not going to, get near her. And I believe, to be honest, that most people, when they meet Jesus, tend to prostrate. They tend to go down.
So when but remember, they're moving. All right, Jesus is moving. They're on their way where? Don't forget where they're on their way.
Yeah.
They're on their way to Jairus's house, right?
Yeah.
And he's moving, and you can imagine he's surrounded by people who are pressing in upon him, right?
Yeah.
So now, all right, let's fight. She comes up, and even if she's on the ground to touch the hem, to me, I won't. I mean, I certainly can imagine that. What happens to that crowd?
They move around her.
If they did that, then wouldn't Jesus have known who touched him?
No, because I don't believe he would have known, because when he goes by her, she's on the ground. It doesn't necessarily mean that she touched him. Somebody else could have touched him as well. Because like you say, it doesn't say the him. All the different gospels doesn't say the him. Some say the him, some don't mention it. So it could have been other people that might have touched him and not necessarily her.
Okay.
Which is why
that's true. Yeah, or if she came from one side, maybe they moved away and Jesus didn't see from that side, especially if she came up from behind him or something like that.
I mean, if the crowd is moving and they're moving by, she just reached out and touched it. I don't think she grabbed it. I think she just,
Yeah.
I vision it as her fingertips just going by.
Okay. Yeah,
And
I just thought myself, the way I've pictured it is if this crowd is just pressing him and she's squeezing her way in through the crowd.
but they're gonna give
And
her room because they don't
no,
want her to touch
but
it.
they're so preoccupied with Jesus, they don't even notice that she's coming around.
Somebody will believe me.
And yeah, so I mean, I just thought, to me, that just went to show how much of a nobody she was to people, in essence, because they don't even realize she's among them. I agree with you, Pat, that had they really focused on her, they had to have known who she was.
Yeah.
After 12 years and all this kind of stuff. But that's interesting. Well, that's why it's fun to play out how you actually envision it in your mind. One other thing, what does it tell us about her in verse 26?
When I read verse 26, this is pretty sad. I get this image of this person. I mean, thinking about the fact that she's been bleeding for 12 years. The doctors have not been able to help her. She's gotten worse, that she now has nothing because everything she had went into going to these doctors. I get this image, and I'm a Lord of the Rings person. I get this image of her, and that she looks like this little shriveled up person, because can you imagine how anemic she must be if she's been bleeding for 12 years? That this little shriveled up person who's probably wrapped herself in some sort of fabric so that she is able to be seen, and going out as this is my last resort. That if I could just,
I think she was desperate.
Yes, extremely.
Right. I'm kind of like with Gwen, Lord of the Rings Golem, that little man who was all shriveled up and bent over. I know. I think she was just completely devastated because, and somebody else said the word too. I was thinking she was just, I can't even think of the word, because it says she suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors.
Play with the line. Has anybody suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors?
Oh my God. I mean, I'm thinking her whole body, everything. It's not just a hemorrhage. Yeah.
Father, this is my image of it. I have this picture, and that's what I always think of when I think of her.
Mm-hmm.
Can y'all see the picture?
Is there any way it can be shared?
Wait a minute. What I'll do is I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, and put it on the screen.
And then so then what you need to do is can you all see Cecilia's now?
Share?
Ronnie's her thing. If you want it bigger, what you do is change your view from the grid view to the speaker view.
Okay.
And then Ronnie talks so your screen will come up for everybody to see.
All right, wait a minute. I don't know how to change it. How do I change it?
Well, you don't need to do it, because it's the others. If you want to get a bigger picture of Cecilia's screen, change your view from the grid to speaker view. And then Ronnie, just talk so that your screen will be the one.
All right, so this is the vision I have. I mean, I've always seen this vision even before I had this picture, and that's why I bought the picture. Is that, like she said, like she was on the ground and maybe people was around her, but not really around her, not even noticing her on the ground.
Right, because that man's about to walk on her.
Right. If people just like walked right over or around her. And that's how she was able to touch Jesus without him seeing her or anybody else noticing her touching him.
Right.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, good.
Thanks.
All right, let's get back to the question. Anybody of you, or do you know anybody who has suffered greatly at the hands of doctors?
Yes.
Anybody want to share?
I gotta figure out how to
share a story.
I would share.
Have to.
When my daughter was after the transplant, and my daughter was in the hospital from May until January, and then when she came home, she was home for a short period, and then back in the hospital. And there were so many things that they did to her. And she went down from, before the transplant, she weighed about 180. And by the time she came home, she was 95 pounds.
Mm.
And she looked, and every bit of it. She had a very thick full head of hair. All of it was gone. And when she came home, she actually herself had that solemn look. You know, it was, and I looked at her and I said, "Oh God, what happened to my baby?" You know, but I was just happy that I had my baby. But she suffered severely, and for the 2 years after the transplant until she passed away, she had numerous procedures that were done on her because it just wasn't, the transplant wasn't working, and her body was just a mess. It was just, her little body was so devastated, and by the time she did pass away, she was 85 pounds.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, this is still going on, right? I mean, it really shows. I mean, and I think that's part of you know, it's not that the doctors are bad people,
No.
or you know, that they're taking all of her money and everything like that. I think the reason St. Mark wants you to know that she suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors, and she spent all that she had, was to point out how limited we are as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
There's only so much we can do for ourselves, right? So no matter how hard we try, there are just certain things that we can't heal. And no matter how much we spend, there's just a limit to the happiness and joy we can bring, right? You know, so I've heard this story interpreted about how this woman was being abused by these doctors and being exploited by them. I'm not sure that's really the point. I don't think the doctors are the bad guys here. I think it just shows how limited we are as humans. There's only so much we can do. And that then highlights the difference between us and Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Father Rich, you have to look at, back in those days, they really didn't know a lot about the body. And we are now in an era where we know some things about our body. And to be perfectly honest, I perfectly think she had a tumor, but I'm not a doctor. And back then, things were looked at a little differently. Things we accept or we figure we can fix, or it's not really a big deal. That was blown up back in those days because they really didn't know. And besides, she was a woman. That was the other part of it. Women were there to serve men. She couldn't serve them. She couldn't do anything. So let's be perfectly honest. Her worth would have been nothing. She would have been worth nothing.
Well, and you could play on that a little bit more too, that even today, I mean, again, today maybe we understand a little bit more about her hemorrhage or something like that, but there's still plenty of illnesses we just don't know anything about. I mean, this virus is one of them.
Right.
But I would agree too. I mean, that's another thing to point out, that even to this day, we know less about diseases that afflict women than we do about diseases that afflict men. We know less about diseases that affect African Americans.
That's true.
We know that about white people. So even our medicine favors one group over another. And but even of the group that it favors, there's still a limit. We are not God. I mean, I think that's basically what that verse 26 is reminding us, that we are not God. No matter how good or smart we think we are, no matter how much money we have to spend, in the end, we're limited. Only God is God. And then that's going to get highlighted by the fact that all of these doctors and all of this money could not cure her, but one touch of the garment of Jesus is enough to heal her. So let's now go
Yeah.
back to this. Go back. So Jesus looks around. He wants to see who he was, come into relationship with her. But verse 33, the woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. What is going on there?
Is it because she's unclean and she should not be touching anyone?
Yeah, do you think that's what she feels?
I think that's what she feels. Yeah,
Yeah, it's very likely. Yeah, that
she's going to be reprimanded for doing what she did.
Yeah, she's of fear because she knows she shouldn't be in the crowd. She shouldn't be touching people. She shouldn't be touching Jesus. And maybe she's afraid that she's going to get in trouble, get reprimanded. Yeah, anybody else have any thoughts about why she may be fear and she might approach him in fear and trembling?
I think that she was probably shocked because according to the story, she only touched his garment or his clothes. She may not have touched him physically, and then was shocked because he recognized that something had happened. Somehow somebody had touched him, and she can't figure out how he would know that if she had just touched his garment.
Okay, so you think her shock is coming from the fear and the trembling. I mean, the fear and the trembling is coming from her shock that he knows power went from him.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's one thing. What else could she? So we got two things. She may be afraid and trembling because she's afraid she's going to get reprimanded for having been in the crowd when she shouldn't have. She may be fear and trembling because she's shocked at that Jesus knows that power went from him, and she only touched his garment. What else might she be in fear and trembling of? I can think of at least one other thing.
Maybe she felt within herself that if she could just get close enough to touch him or any part of him or his garment, that the fact of the healing and her faith that she could be healed would it brought a shock to her.
Yeah, okay.
It happened.
Yeah, I look at the line, realizing what had happened to her. Okay, so remember, fear and trembling, and today we tend to see that mostly as being afraid of and scared and that kind of stuff, which would definitely feed into Renee's comment about her being afraid of being reprimanded. So that it could definitely be that. But fear and trembling was also a way that one would react to the presence of God, right? The fear of the Lord, you know, and it's the idea that one is so awestruck by the presence of God that one begins to fear and tremble because God is so awesome. You know, we tremble in God's presence because of our puniness of human beings. So another way of interpreting this is that she knows that a God event has just happened. She knows that she has just encountered God. And as anyone would who knew they were in the presence of God, she comes in fear and trembling. So it could be all of that. I'm not saying there's only one way of looking at it. But Esther would say that she probably realized he was God because he knew power had gone from him. And so that shows something about him. But she could have also known that he was God simply by the fact of what had happened to her. Or she could have been in fear and trembling because of her choice to break all these norms to come in contact with Jesus. All of them could be why she was in fear and trembling. All right, so then Jesus, of course, doesn't reprimand her. He says, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured." of your affliction. All right. Any significance in calling her daughter?
Back to relationship.
Back to relationship. And what's the relationship here being established?
She's a child of God.
A child of God.
Yeah. He could have said sister, right?
Yeah.
Right.
He could have said woman, first of all,
Mm-hmm.
which again in those days would not have been a term of disrespect. It would have just said, human being, woman. But could have said sister, but he says daughter, and really establishes her as a child of God. And then, as we already said, your faith has saved you.
But Father Rich, doesn't he think of us as his children?
Yes, I mean that's why he would use the term daughter.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. In that case, I mean, we're also brothers and sisters to Jesus, but in this case, he's using that relationship. And then your faith has saved you. Okay. Right. Let's continue because the story goes on. So back to you, Karen.
Okay. While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue's official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, how do you pronounce that, Father?
Talitha kuam.
Which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that, they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this and said that she should be given something to eat.
All right. Okay, what do you see? What are your impressions of this part of the story here?
So, well,
Is
this
this
is
another
like,
testing of faith?
Another testing of faith, and where do you see that, Valerie?
Even though it had been announced that the child had died, Jairus continued with Jesus and the disciples, and they went anyway, following Jesus's orders. So, I don't know how to put it.
Yeah, actually, he says something, right? What do you look at verse 36? What does Jesus actually say to them?
Yes, he said to them, disregard. Jesus said to the synagogue, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid.
But
Just have faith."
yeah, just have faith. Yeah. So this is clearly a test in faith. Yeah, absolutely. So another area that faith is important. Any other things you pick up in the story? Any little facts that you have questions about? Why is this or why is that? Or facts that you notice that might relate it to the other story?
I think you notice he asked them to feed her, which is the same thing Jesus did when he came into the room. He asked to be fed because back then people believed in ghosts and ghosts didn't eat. You can't feed a ghost.
Oh, okay. So you mean when after Jesus had risen from the dead and he wanted to eat?
Right, when he risen, after he rose, he asked to be fed because ghosts don't eat. And the same thing, he asked that young child be fed to let them know she is real. She's not a ghost. You're not imagining it. She is a real fresh.
Okay, that's a really neat point. I've never read anybody making that connection to this story. And I think that actually is an excellent point, that she
True.
wasn't a ghost, that she truly was alive and before them. So that's a very interesting point. All right, any other, play with that a little bit about the language he uses to her. Pat, go back to verse 41.
You know what kind of struck me between the two stories is that in the past we've heard talk about Jesus curing people, but in stories there was actually some sort of physical contact with the woman in the hemorrhage. She touched his garment that he had on, and in this case he took the little girl's hand. And so that shows that there, in these cases, there was some physical. And I've heard people, use that term, the laying on of hands, to help heal. So I kind of made that connection.
Okay, yeah, physical touch is a very important part. It's not essential, because we will learn later that Jesus can just command that something happen, and it happens, right? And that's what we'll learn that later with the centurion's household member. I think in one case it's a slave, in another case it might be a son. I'm not sure, but where speak but the word, and my servant shall be healed. But in these cases so far, yes, touch is very important. And, even if you've ever watched the sacrament of the sick being celebrated, there is the laying on of hands, right? And it's interesting because they got a ruling for during this time of COVID, we don't actually have to touch you for that to happen. We can just extend our hands over you. But that was a real question during this time when they didn't want us touching other people for fear that we would spread the, if we were infected, we would infect that person, or if they were infected, they would infect us. So they did get a ruling that that touch is not necessary, but it clearly is a big part of it. And obviously, I'm sure once this virus goes away, we'll go back to touching people because it's an important element. What about the language that he says to her? Little girl, I say to you, arise. This was sort of what I was asking Pat to play out.
It sounds like the same language that he used with Lazarus.
It's the same language he uses with Lazarus. That's right. And what else? What other language is language of arising?
It's right. It's like being risen from
the resurrection.
Resurrection. Yeah, these are in Greek. These are all the same words that are being used. They're variants of the same word for resurrection. So that I think is really cool. The way that even connects even more to Pat's point is the little girl now has arisen, but she is not a ghost. Just like when Jesus arises, he will not be a ghost. Okay, good. Anything else that you see? There is another little.
There are two things that are standing out to me. One is a small thing, and then I'll go to the one that's a little more complex, and I need your help with. The first thing is that when he went in, he took his select three.
Okay.
Peter, James, and John. And then the other thing is that, little girl. And this girl is 12 years old, and there's the 12 again, because the woman was bleeding for 12 years. The little girl is 12 years old, and he's calling her little girl, but at 12 years old, she's probably just about premenstrual. And then she's, because by about 13, they're getting married, so she's just on the cusp of little girl to woman. And so I find those things interesting. I need a little help with.
Okay. All right. We'll play with it a little bit more because I think you're seeing that this is a real connection to the other one. How did they distinguish between a girl and a woman? What made you a woman?
Your menstrual cycle.
I would think your menstrual period.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Your menstrual cycle.
You were considered a woman because you could bear children.
Right. Yes.
Right.
So that is definitely, And obviously you all know it varies with girls, but about when would the menstrual cycle begin?
About 13.
13.
About, right, 12 or 13. So the middle story, the woman, here's a woman who has been having difficulty with this menstrual cycle for 12 years, which is the same. This little girl has been alive for the whole time that this girl, that the woman has been suffering this hemorrhaging, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she, during those 12 years, is not yet able to bear life herself, right? She's on the cusp of being able to bear life, correct?
Correct, and almost losing her life.
And the woman cannot bear life during these 12 years, right?
Right.
And so what has Jesus done for both females? So we won't have to worry about the term woman or girl. What has he done for them?
They've had a restoration.
I know Dee's trying to talk, but we're not getting. You have to use your phone connection, Dee. We're not getting you. Yeah, use your phone because your audio connection is still garbled. Oh, you are trying to use it? Yeah. See, we're not getting. I'm sorry, Dee. Someone else. I think somebody else was saying.
Type it into the chat.
There's a point of restoration for both of them.
Yeah. There's like a restoration and now after these two healings, both of these women are going to be able to give life, right? Presumably
that's what Dee wanted to say.
Yeah, that's what Dee wanted to say. The older woman, assuming she's not, we can only assume that she's not too old to bear women. That's why she probably wouldn't have been continuing to hemorrhage. And this little girl is now she's going to live to become a woman. And so these healings are not just restoring these people to health or restoring them to the community or their families. It's actually allowing them to bear life. What's that?
Call from Belgium.
Oh, that's somebody's phone is ringing and we're getting your. Okay, so this is not, Jesus is not only restoring these two characters to life, he's actually, in essence, restoring their descendants, right? I mean, there will be descendants because of what Jesus has done. So Jesus gives life in abundance, right? It's not just the life to these two women. It's also the lives that they will bear, who will benefit from his healing and his power.
And for the older woman, it also gives her dignity.
It gives, right. It restores her to her dignity. We don't know if she is married now, she can return to her husband and her family, right?
Right.
And she can be a wife and a mother. So I mean, the healing is exponential. In other words, it's far more than just the healing of the hemorrhage and the restoring of this girl to life. It's like the fullness of life, that Jesus is restoring here. One other thing I want to point out.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
In this case, he's instructing not to share the information. In the other stories, it last in verse 43, he gave strict orders that no one should know. Okay, in other cases,
let's come back to that. Okay, we'll finish with that. Yeah. No, because that is something I definitely want to point out. Let's look at this. So he arrives, and there are people weeping and wailing loudly. Anybody understand what that's a reference to?
To her death.
Yeah, and the way they mourned back then. You didn't just sniffle and put a handkerchief to your tears, to your eyes. I mean,
That was it.
mourning was a huge deal. It was visible and it was audible. You really engaged in it, and apparently, even at this time, there were professional mourners. So that if you didn't have a family to mourn you, you would hire people to come and weep and wail in order to acknowledge your death, because that would have been like one of the gravest. I don't want to say insults, but like a gravest tragedy is for someone to die and have no one to mourn their loss. So clearly these folks think this little girl is dead, right? And Jesus says, well, why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep. All right. Now this is a problematic line here. What do you see? What do you think Jesus is saying, and why do you think it could be a problem?
What, that she sleep?
Yeah, that she is not dead but asleep. There's two ways you can interpret this.
They are so convinced that she's dead, but then Jesus has his intentions and he knows what he's going to do. So he dispels this from them. This thought tries to dispel this thought from them, because he's going to bring the child back. He's going to say, arise. So that's why I think he had everybody to leave, so as not to have witness by so many, but to just have the ones there that the mother, the father, and his disciples along with him.
Let me press it a little. Okay, go ahead, Esther.
No, I agree with Valerie, but to me, from other stuff I've read, it's like that's a contradiction, because he says she's not dead, but in other places in the Bible, when people fell asleep, it's like they went into death or whatever the next phase was, but they were not alive. That seems to be contradictory to me.
All right, so in order to play this out, we're going to have to be a little bit medical here. Okay.
Father Rich, could it be that he didn't want them, the outside people and everything, to believe that she was dead and he was bringing her back? Because you know how many people would be rushing up and want him to bring back their child or their loved one? I mean, then that would mean he'd either have to do it all or he'd have to pick and choose who he brings back. So if you think that she's asleep and he's just waking her up, oh, okay, no big deal.
Okay.
So he's not going to be bombarded with bring back my loved one.
Pat, you always come up with the most interesting interpretation. That is another one. That is another one that I have never heard before. To try to keep business manageable, we'll play with these words so people won't know what really is going on.
So modern day, we'd say she's in a coma.
Well, no, but that's what I want to get to here. Is this girl's heart beating?
Apparently, they don't think it is. I would think somebody had touched her or checked something before they came to the conclusion that she was dead.
Okay. So clearly they think she's dead, right? Physically, like her whatever they do to check on people, they've done, and they've determined that as a physical matter, right? Her physical medical matter, she's dead. Okay. Mm-hmm. When Jesus says she is not dead, but asleep, is he saying that as a physical medical matter, she's not dead, that actually she still is alive, but she's she's just asleep and I'm going to kind of wake her up? Or
So
does he agree that she is physically, medically dead?
So I take it that Jesus is saying she's just not aware, or she hasn't heard the word. I think of it with Jesus's ministry. That
Well, let's just work first. Do you think Jesus thinks she's physically, medically dead?
No, I don't think he does.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
I don't know. I think he does. I think she is.
I think
she's dead.
But then her death will be reversed.
Resurrected, yeah.
Okay, well let's play it. Let me. There's two ways of interpreting this other than Pat's. Okay, Pat's is the third way.
Father, would it have anything to do with eternal life?
Well, right, yeah. So it's exact. So what sort of the mainstream and sort of like the accepted understanding of this is that this child is physically, medically dead. Okay. Her heart is stopped. She's not breathing. Her brain is dead. However you want to define the way we would define death today. She has died. But when Jesus says she's not dead, he's referring to a spiritual death. In other words, she's not lost. She's still, her spirit or her soul still lives, but the spirit and the soul is just simply asleep. And so what he does is he really does bring her back to human medical life but she's never been dead. Like, as far as God is concerned, she's never been separated from God. So, we talk about the big D death and the little d death. So we, as Christians, we baptized, we will all experience the little d death. All of us, I'm sorry to inform you that all of us will someday, our hearts will stop beating, our brains will stop, and we will be medically, physically dead. But that's a little d death. We will not experience, as long as we remain united with God and Jesus, we will not experience the big D death, which is total separation from God and death from all that God is and all that God has done and all that God has created. Jesus's death and resurrection shattered the big D death. And so what most of us would say is this little girl did die, and Jesus did bring him back to life, bring her back to life. And his reference is she didn't experience the big D death. And that's why she was asleep. The problem is that because you have this, there were people then, and there probably are still people today, who said the girl never really died. She was just asleep. And Jesus just woke her up. So it's a healing, not a raising from the dead. Do you understand that?
Right.
Father Rick, we've had instances where people have died on the operating table. I mean, literally, they say dead, the brain, the whole 9 yards. But that person has come back and they're living. So I think, God is in it, their belief in God, and God said, maybe I'm not ready for you yet for the big D. Here's your little d. And some people come back and talk about,
no. There's no doubt. I mean, I don't have any doubt that this little girl died medically, and how Jesus restores her to life, that's up to Jesus and God. What I'm saying is that critics of Jesus will say this little girl never really died. She only fell asleep. And
that's good.
But then this is no longer a raising from the dead. This is just healing. This is just waking somebody up who had fallen asleep. So there were people who denied that Jesus actually ever raised anyone from the dead.
Not even Lazarus?
And well, that's what I'm getting to. And that's why, what does St. John tell us for sure when Jesus arrives at the tomb of Lazarus?
He smelled.
He
Right.
smelled it.
Make sure that he was
He's been
really
dead
dead.
for 3 days.
He'd been
That's
dead
why he
for
waited
4
so long.
days.
4
He'd been
days.
dead
Okay.
for 4
He's been
days.
dead a while.
So there
Why
could
he
be
waited so
no
long.
doubt that that man was dead.
Mhm.
Okay. All of the other, now pay attention when you read the Gospels, all of the other healing, all of the other raising from the dead, Jesus does within 24 hours of the person's death. Okay. So this girl, obviously, it's only maybe been an hour or so that she's been dead. You remember the widow and her son, and they're at the funeral. You know, they're bringing him out to bury him, and he restores the young man to life. Remember that story?
Mhm.
Under Jewish custom, that had to have occurred within 24 hours of his death.
Right.
Okay, so there were people who, the opponents or critics of Jesus, given the stories that they knew, would say Jesus didn't actually raise anybody from the dead, because all of these people were within a period of time where they could have really been asleep, you know, in a coma, as Gwen said, and Jesus just lifted them out of a coma. But that's why when St. John tells you the story of Lazarus, he makes it clear that Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. Okay.
Well, if the girl was in a coma, I want to say, if the girl was in a coma, how did Jesus have the power to raise him from the dead? Because, I mean, raise the little girl up, because everybody doesn't have that power. So
Oh, right. Oh, no. But it's just that all that becomes a healing power.
Mhm.
Okay. As opposed to raising someone from the dead. It's far more impressive to raise someone from the dead than it is to heal them.
Right, exactly.
Okay. So that's all I'm saying is that in Jesus's day and later, people may have said, well, look, he was a healer. All right. There were other healers. Big deal. But he never raised anyone from the dead because of things like this, that the episode occurred within 24 hours of the person's death. We're getting feedback. I don't know if that's coming from you, Dee.
It is coming from me. I'm trying to
Okay.
get it out.
So do you understand what I was trying to say?
Mhm.
So that phrase, she's not dead but asleep, we have to be very clear with ourselves as Christians. The way we interpret this story is that girl did die. You know, she was as medically dead as anybody else could be. And that this is a raising from the dead. This is not merely a healing. So it's a different category, in essence, of God's power, of Jesus's power. So, you know, he has the power to expel demons. He has the power to heal the sick. And now he has the power to raise the dead. And this is the first instance of Jesus raising someone from the dead. Okay. So then let me just answer was it Karen, about he gave strict orders
Right.
that no one should know. Now, remember, we kind of covered this last week. He was in Gentile territory. And remember the man he healed, the man who he expelled the demons from, wanted to join Jesus. And Jesus said, no, go home and tell everybody what God has done for you, right?
Right.
And yet here he is saying, don't tell anybody. Remember what we had said last week? Who who were the people last week that he was talking to?
So last week he was talking to the
He was
Gentiles.
talking to the Gentiles.
Last week he was talking to
Gentiles.
Gentiles. And remember what we said? Did Gentiles had any sense of a Messiah?
No.
No, because Messiah is a Jewish.
Right.
Thing. So Jesus wasn't particularly concerned that the Gentiles would misinterpret who he was as a Messiah, because they could care less, right?
Right.
So he had no problem with saying, go tell everybody what God has done for you, what the God of Israel has done for you, right?
Right.
But here, who's he talking to?
The Jews.
The Israelites, the Jews.
And the Jews. And do these Jews have a sense of who the Messiah is?
Most definitely.
Yes.
They certainly have their own sense, but do they have the right sense of who a Messiah is?
No.
No.
No, not
So
a
Jesus
No.
did not want them going around saying, hey, guess what? Guess who I had at my house the other day? The Messiah showed up. Okay. So right now in Mark's gospel, when Jesus is talking to Jews, he doesn't want them to talk about what he's doing because he's afraid they're going to misunderstand who he is as the Messiah. Okay. Whereas when he's talking to Gentiles, he doesn't really care because they don't even know who the Messiah is. Does that make sense to you, Karen?
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay. But that's a really good observation as to.
Well, the word you use, Jesus, afraid. Well, God is afraid. He just knows what they're going to do. So I don't think we want to use that word.
All right. Or he's concerned, maybe.
Concerned. That might be a word that we could use. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So there you go. There's another really two stories, but I think it's really, do you see why Mark put these two stories together?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's, historically, we don't know necessarily that these two healings occurred in this order, in the way it happened. What we could probably say is, there was a healing of a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years, and there was the raising of a 12-year-old girl. And Mark may have put the two together because he saw a connection between the two. We don't know. It could have happened exactly the way it's said, but I think at least by putting the two stories together, you get that extra powerful punch.
Yeah.
Of this abundance of life, that women are life givers, and in each of these cases, by healing these two women in their circumstances, Jesus has assured that these two women now will continue to give life.
Okay, and Father Rich, but isn't there a big difference between bringing somebody back from the dead and healing somebody?
Yes, that's exactly what I was saying, why it's important for us as Christians to understand that we do believe this girl was dead. That Jesus's reference to that she's not dead but asleep is more of a spiritual reference, that her soul has not been separated from God, but even though her body is dead. So that's exactly right, because it creates, this is clearly a raising from the dead, not just simply a healing for someone who was in a coma.